6 days. That is the distance between the night Bruce Lee died and the night Enter the Dragon opened. 6 days, not years, not months, not decades, 6 days. He had spent 15 years fighting to reach that premiere. He had refused every compromise, every smaller role, every studio executive who told him that America was not ready for an Asian leading man. He had built the film himself, frame by frame, on his own terms. And on July 20th, 1973, 37 days before the lights went down and the screen lit up and the audience saw what he had made, he was gone. His seat was empty. It stayed empty. This is the story of the 6 days that separated Bruce Lee from the moment he had spent his entire life trying to reach. To understand what Enter the Dragon meant to Bruce Lee, you have to understand what the 15 years before it had looked like. He had arrived in America from Hong Kong in 1959 with a few dollars, a partial foundation in Wing Chun, and an absolute certainty that was not shared by anyone else in the American entertainment industry. He believed that a Chinese actor could carry a Hollywood film. He believed this not as a wish or a hope, but as a practical conviction, the kind that does not require external validation because it is grounded in something you know about yourself, rather than something you are waiting for others to confirm. The industry did not agree. The specific phrase that Bruce Lee heard repeatedly and from multiple directions over multiple years was this: American audiences are not ready for an Asian leading man. He heard it from the executive who passed on the concept he had developed for a television series about a Chinese martial artist in the American West, the concept that became Kung Fu, starring a white actor. He heard it from the casting directors who saw him and liked him and could not put him in anything that required the audience to follow him from scene 1 to the last frame. He heard it in the roles he was offered: the sidekick, the exotic, the martial arts instructor, the supporting color, and in the roles he was not offered, which were the ones he actually wanted. He spent this period doing what he always did with obstacles. He worked around them. He taught privately: Steve McQueen, James Coburn, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, people whose names opened doors that his own name could not yet open. He wrote. He trained with an intensity that people who trained with him found difficult to describe in ordinary terms. He went to Hong Kong, where the door that had been closed to him in America was opened, and he made 4 films in 2 years that made him the biggest star in Asia. The Big Boss broke box office records. Fist of Fury broke the Big Boss's record. Way of the Dragon, which Bruce wrote, directed, and starred in, broke both. Each film was released in Hong Kong to responses that neither the studio executives in Los Angeles nor the network producers in New York had apparently considered when they told him that audiences were not ready. Warner Brothers came to him. This was not the sequence that Hollywood usually followed. The actor called the studio. But by 1972, the calculus had changed enough that Warner Brothers initiated contact. They had watched Bruce Lee become the biggest star in Asia on a budget that would have funded a medium-sized American television episode. They had seen the box office numbers. They had done the arithmetic. They wanted a piece of what he had built. They wanted to make a film with Bruce Lee. They wanted a co-production with Golden Harvest, the Hong Kong studio that had made his previous 3 films. They wanted access to what he had built in Asia and to bring it to a global audience on a scale that Golden Harvest alone could not achieve. Bruce Lee knew exactly what he wanted in return: final cut approval, the right to be the last person who decided what went into the film and what did not, script input that went beyond consultation, a percentage of the gross, not just a flat fee, which meant that if the film succeeded, he would share in that success rather than simply being paid a fixed amount and watching the profits go elsewhere. These were not trivial demands in 1972. They were the kind of demands that major American studios fielded from major American stars and frequently rejected even then.
From a Chinese actor who had never led a Hollywood production, they were extraordinary. But Bruce had the leverage of Asia behind him, and he used it. The deal that resulted was not everything he wanted, but it was substantially more than the industry standard for what someone in his position would have received. He took it. Filming on Enter the Dragon began in Hong Kong in January 1973. Bruce was 32 years old. He was, by the assessment of everyone who worked with him on set, at the absolute peak of his physical abilities, sharper, faster, more focused than he had been on any previous production. The film's fight choreography was his. The philosophy behind the film, the way it engaged with questions of identity and authenticity and the politics of martial arts cinema, was his. The presence that came through the camera, the quality that made every scene he appeared in feel different from every scene he did not, was his. Post-production was completed in early 1973. Warner Bros. Scheduled the American premiere for August 19. The Hong Kong premiere followed. A release date meant a fixed point in time toward which everything had been building, a specific evening when the work would be finished and the world would see it. Bruce Lee had been working toward a fixed point like this for 15 years. He did not reach it. On May 10, 1973, during a post-production dubbing session at Golden Harvest, Bruce collapsed. He lost consciousness, experienced seizures, and was rushed to Baptist Hospital, where doctors diagnosed cerebral edema, swelling of the brain. He recovered, was flown to Los Angeles for evaluation, was told by American specialists that he had pushed his body past certain limits and that the results of doing so were physiological rather than cosmetic. He returned to Hong Kong. He continued working. On the evening of July 20, 1973, at an apartment on Beacon Hill Road in Kowloon, Bruce Lee took a painkiller for a headache, lay down to rest, and did not wake up. He was 32 years old. The cause of death, determined at the subsequent inquest, was cerebral edema, the same condition that had put him in hospital 10 weeks earlier. He had been warned. He had not stopped. Enter the Dragon was scheduled to open in America on August 19, 1973. That was 30 days away. In Hong Kong, the premiere was set for the same period. The film was finished. The posters were printed. The trailers were running. The machinery of a major studio release was already in motion, and it continued in motion because it had no mechanism for stopping.
The Hong Kong premiere of Enter the Dragon took place as scheduled. The audience that filled the cinema that evening came to see a film by a man they had watched become, over the previous 2 years, the most famous person in Asia. They knew he was dead. They had known for a month. The news had broken on July 20 and had traveled across the region with the speed and force that the death of someone genuinely beloved always travels. There had been mourning and disbelief, and the specific public grief that attaches to people who seem too vital and too present to be gone. And now the audience sat in the dark and watched him on screen, alive, present, moving with the quality that no camera had ever quite captured completely, but that every camera that had pointed at him had attempted, and they had to hold two contradictory truths simultaneously. The person on the screen, who was undeniably and completely there, and the knowledge that the person on the screen was not there at all anymore. The film itself was extraordinary. This was not the polite consensus of people being generous about someone who had just died. It was the genuine response of audiences encountering something they had not seen before. Bruce Lee at the center of a Hollywood-produced film, on his own terms, carrying every scene, making the American co-stars around him look exactly as capable as they were, and no more. The action sequences were unlike anything that had been in an American film. The physical presence was unlike anything.
The wit and the intelligence that came through even in scenes that required nothing beyond fighting, these were the qualities that the studio executives had apparently not been able to imagine when they told him America was not ready. People who were at that premiere have described the experience in consistent terms over the 50 years since. They describe watching the film as one of the strangest and most affecting experiences of their lives, not because the film was bad, but because of the specific quality of watching someone who is not there anymore be entirely present on screen. Because of the gap between what the eye sees and what the mind knows. Because of the seat in the theater that was reserved for him and that nobody sat in. Raymond Chow, who had produced all 4 of Bruce Lee's Hong Kong films, attended the premiere. He said afterward that he could not watch the film. He sat in the theater and could not look at the screen for most of it. The grief was too specific. It was not the generalized sadness of losing someone you admired from a distance. It was the grief of someone who had been in rooms with this man, who had negotiated contracts and argued about scripts and driven to set and eaten meals, and who was now watching the product of all of that in a theater full of people who were discovering for the first time what the 2 of them had spent 3 years building together. Enter the Dragon was released in the United States on August 19, 1973. It opened at number 1. It remained in the top 10 for months. It was eventually released in over 20 countries and earned over its theatrical run and subsequent home video and broadcast life more than $200 million, a figure that would be several times higher in today's money. It is consistently cited in retrospective rankings as one of the most influential action films ever made. The Library of Congress selected it for preservation in the National Film Registry in 2004, the year it was declared culturally significant enough to be protected as part of the permanent American cultural record.
Bruce Lee never saw any of it. He never sat in a cinema and watched the film he had spent 15 years fighting to make. He never heard an audience react to a scene he had designed, never read a review, never received any of the response that the film produced in the world, because by the time the world responded, he was not there. This is the specific cruelty at the center of this story, not the death itself, which was terrible enough, but the timing. 6 days. The gap between what he had built and what he was allowed to see of what he had built was 6 days. If the premiere had been in June rather than August, he would have seen it. If he had died in September rather than July, he would have seen it. The margin was not a year or a decade, it was 6 days. Linda Lee, his wife, attended the Hong Kong premiere without him. Brandon was 8 years old. Shannon was 4. Linda had spent the weeks since July 20 managing the practical consequences of what had happened, the arrangements, the legal questions, the financial questions, the public attention that descended on a family that had lost someone while the world was watching. And now she was sitting in a theater watching her husband be alive on a screen. She has said in multiple interviews over the years that she did not know how to watch the film, that she sat through it in a state that was not exactly grief and not exactly pride, but something that contained both and more besides, something that did not have a name. She watched her husband on screen, fully alive, doing everything he had been trying to do for 15 years, doing it better than anyone had expected, and she thought about the fact that he had never gotten to see it. She thought about the reviews he would never read. She thought about the conversations she would never have with him about what the film had become, and she thought about the 6 days. 6 days. The gap was not a year or a decade. It was not even a month. It was 6 days. The distance between the end of one thing and the beginning of another, between the completion of 15 years of work and the moment when that work found its audience. He had crossed every other distance. He had survived Hong Kong and Seattle and Los Angeles and the years of rejection and the physical collapse and the surgeries and the doubts and the people who told him it was impossible. He had crossed all of it, and the last 6 days he did not cross. Bruce Lee once wrote in the private notebooks that his family found after his death, "The key to immortality is first living a life worth remembering." He wrote this years before Enter the Dragon. He wrote it in the context of martial arts philosophy, not in any anticipation of what was coming, but it reads differently now. It reads like someone who understood at some level that the life was the thing, and that what happened to the life after was its own separate question, one that the person who had lived it would not be around to answer. He was right about both. The life was worth remembering, and the answer to what happened after, $200 million, the Library of Congress, 50 years of global recognition, a seat in every cinema that has ever screened Enter the Dragon, he never got to hear. 6 days. That was the distance. It stayed that way. If this story moved you, subscribe and leave a comment. What do you think Bruce Lee would have felt sitting in that theater watching Enter the Dragon for the first time? Share this video with someone who needs to understand what 6 days can mean. And tell us in the comments, is there a more heartbreaking story in the history of cinema?